Hey, it's Bowral, the Outback historian, and I'm here with Don Bradman at the Bradman Museum. He's one of Australia's great heroes, but I'm going to introduce you to another hero that you may not have met before, an 83-year-old man who spent a great deal of his life in the Northern Territory with the Indigenous people, doing an amazing job, and I'm going to take you inside. We're going to have coffee and we're going to meet him. Here we are in the Bradman Museum. This is Ken Hansen, and we're surrounded by a lifetime's work in these books here that you and your wife have written, but they're not just any books. You better explain what they are.
No, they're books that have been written through the efforts of Aboriginal people in Central Australia in the Bindabulurich group that my wife and I started work in that group in 1966. And then later we moved across to Western Australia and worked with the Murrumbidgee people around Port Hedland and east of Port Hedland, and we worked there developing text material of their language and interacting with them, and then they helped us to translate the New Testament, most of the New Testament, into their language. And in Bindabulurich we went back again to Bindabulurich and we did further work. My wife is trained as a school teacher, and so she developed teaching materials in the Bindabulurich language in Central Australia, and as a result of that she was helping to teach people their language, but I'd done a lot of that earlier on before we went over to Western Australia for 5 years. That was about 1991, I think. And we came back and she was doing literacy and teaching people to read and write their own language. They wanted to read and write their own language in the schools, but elsewhere, adults as well.
Because you're saying, like, obviously you've come from like a missionary background, to use that word that probably sets a lot of people on edge. You're saying that the people welcomed you there to come and translate their language. So a lot of people would feel that missionaries impose themselves and their religion on the Aboriginal people. What sort of responses were you getting from them?
Well, when we first went to Papunya in Central Australia after my wife Leslie and I were married, people wanted us to come and learn their language and be able to talk to them in their language. They had some Europeans on Papunya settlement who spoke to them in English, but they didn't understand it very well. And when they were asked whether they were happy for us to come and learn their language and use that, they were very happy for us to come.
So they didn't feel that you were imposing something on them?
They didn't feel that we were being an imposition by learning language. They were interested and enthusiastic to teach us how to speak their language. And so when we went out on hunting trips and my wife went out on food gathering trips with the women, I went with the men, then they would teach us how to say certain phrases and sentences that were associated with what we were doing.
So in other words, you went as a learner first before you came as a teacher?
Exactly, we went as learners, and they knew that, and we lived in a small caravan at the side of their camp, and so we didn't live up on the community where the shop was and the office other white people were staying.
Not many people, in my experience, not many people would do what you've done. You know, what's it, 40 years you lived out there?
Yes.
Pretty basic circumstances. Did you raise a family there as well?
Yes, that's right. Yes.
That's a bit rare, and would spend a whole lifetime translating what's it, hymns?
Yes.
New Testament?
New Testament, and an Old Testament combined in the one Lorich language now.
That's all
Aboriginal, yes, but Aboriginal people were working with us, together with us, to produce this. They wanted it in their own language because the Aranda people had God's word in their language, and so they wanted God's word. They knew the importance of the story about Christ and what he'd done to help them and help all people, and they wanted that in their language.
How did that fit with their traditional religion or the traditional view of life and cosmology?
Well, their traditional view of life was still with them as we worked with them. They would have some ceremonies, they would go to certain spots and carry out a ceremony associated with a sacred spot. They would also have men's and women's ceremonies for the young women and the young men, and they would have these things, but they wanted the word of Jesus Christ and of God, because they had learned that there were problems in their culture, like revenge expeditions that went and came in and would kill off several of them at one time. And these revenge expeditions could come from people who were a long way off. And they had ascertained through sorcery, those people, that this group was responsible for the death of one or two of their relatives. And so they would come across, walking through the desert in a group for several days and at times weeks, and then they would surprise the group and they would spear them and make sure they speared as many people as they could, or particularly the person that was judged to have caused the death of the other person.
So Ken, you're saying they wanted to change that? Like you weren't saying to them, you've got to stop doing that, or you've got to stop doing those ceremonies because that's all evil. They were coming to that decision?
We were not telling them they should stop any ceremony. We were saying, we can help you to have God's word in your language if you work with us. And they said, yes, we want that in our language because God can help us with the problems we have in our culture. And one of them, Blind Moses, said to his Aranda people earlier on, he said, if it wasn't for God and God's word that the missionaries taught us, we would still be killing each other off and there would be hardly any of our people left because of these revenge expeditions. And the Binabilorich people felt the same way, that they didn't want this to go on any longer. They didn't want to have to take revenge expeditions on other people, and they didn't want revenge expeditions coming, and so they felt that God's word had answers to this, and certainly it did have answers.
Okay.